normally I don't like to read from notes. You know me, you've seen me for years come to the lectern and plop down notes, and I don't even look at them. But this is one where in this particular form, these are my notes, and I should read them because there's a lot of information here. I don't want to miss anything. So I'll be glancing down at material that I have in front of me. This is what I want to tell you. If searching this subject matter brings us to a better understanding of why the writer of Hebrews introduced this person, of whom, as I've said, there's only 4 verses in the Old Testament mentioning this person, Melchizedek. And we can come to some clarity as to not so much the person, but the purpose, then I have accomplished my goal. The thing that I have been against, I saw this early on, the myriad number of subjects that Dr. Scott taught on. If these subjects, lost tribes is probably at the top. Second to that, there are these pyramid and other teachings. If they lead you to a stronger faith and lead you back into the scriptures, great. But my observation is that most people got extremely fascinated with those subjects. And rather than being reminded that it should bring you about face and back to the very thing that you exist for, getting to know, as Jesus says in John 17, the one true God and his Son, Jesus Christ, whom he has sent, unless it brings you back there, you're going to go astray. You'll be fascinated by the subject, and it will lure you away from the scriptures. And that is what I saw happen here with many people. They got wrapped up in it. And don't get me wrong, there's a great excitement in exploring subjects that are kind of on the fringe and less taught on. But I'm giving you my caution up front. My purpose for doing this is to bring a greater understanding both to the text, as Genesis and Psalms mention Melchizedek, and then to come full circle back to Hebrews so that we can go back into the study with a solid foundation of the purpose and the intent of the writer. So, having said that, a combination of Bible reading and my tablet is going to be our best friend tonight. I don't know, I'm still praying about whether or not, because I've got so much information put out, whether or not I will make this available at some point. I'm almost wanting to see how this goes, to see whether or not I will, either in PDF or in some format, put this information somewhere available. I don't know yet. I'm going to pray about it. So 2 things, 2 observations from the beginning. When people mention the name Melchizedek, you get great excitement and great speculation. Our concern in this series of studies that we're going to do is going to be with approximately the first 5 centuries of church history. But before we can tackle those first 5 centuries, we have to deal with primary sources. So I'm starting tonight with primary sources. We'll go to canonical, non-canonical, or included in that / extra biblical texts. We will use many different resources, of which I will bring here and I may read out of, or I may just quote. Some of them are embedded in my brain already. There's a kind of cutoff date of when in church history the interest was somewhat lost, and for good reason, which when we get there, I will explain that as well. So we begin the study with, as I've said, 4 verses. We have Genesis 14, verses 18 through 20, that mention Melchizedek. And part of studying this is kind of interesting when you think about it. How could someone who takes up here 18, 19, and 20, that's all. He appears out of nowhere and he disappears just the same. Now, there's so many things that along the way I will introduce more questions and I won't answer them immediately. We can't until we exhaust all the material. I can tell you that some of you have already formed conclusions of who Melchizedek is, and I'm asking that even with your formed conclusions, you examine all the evidence. There are many people in the Bible who appear very strangely, and we'll mention them tonight as well. There's no explanation as to where they came from or what their reason for appearing is. And as I said, Melchizedek is one of those. Can you imagine verses 18, 19, and 20 of the book of Genesis, chapter 14, and then silence for, I don't even want to get into dating this book, but we can know that David will write Psalm 110, and hypothetically, if he wrote Psalm 110 somewhere around 1000 perhaps, somewhere in that vicinity. And it's just a ballpark, it's vague. Imagine there is a gap of 1,000+ years, and I'm being very vague about dating anything because that's not my focus, between the few verses here and his mention in the Psalms. And then there's this great fascination with who this person is. Can you imagine that? Just being almost a fly on the radar, and yet everybody's interested in who this person is. So it goes to show you that being mysterious it pays off, right? But in order for us to fully digest some of the information, some of it we're going to go straight into the scriptures, we'll see the benefit of, instead of isolating the 14th chapter of Genesis, the benefit of looking at Genesis from at least the 13th chapter through to the 15th chapter and the first verse. And I'll give you the first reason behind that. Many scholars have hypothesized that verses 18, 19, and 20 were added as a gloss, what's called a gloss in the scholars' world. It was added in there at a later time. That could be tenable and do no injustice to the body, to the corpus of the text, except for one problem. Verse 22, where Abraham, it says, "And Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted up my hand unto the Lord, the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth." And in part, he is repeating something that Melchizedek said to him. So if the portions, verses 18, 19, and 20, were removed, the problem would remain of what relevance did this verse 22, Abraham saying to the king of Sodom, "I've lifted up my hand unto the Lord, the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth, and will not take a thread, even a shoe latchet." What would be the relevance? It would be missed. So the first thing we can conclude is I highly doubt it's a later addition, and I believe it was an integral part of the body of what's here. Now, that's a very easy observation to make. A more difficult observation is if we consider the whole text, and we're going to go back and read the whole text of the 14th chapter. I'm going to take some reverse steps here. One of the reasons why you need to be reading the 13th chapter to make sense of the 14th is the fact that when the herdsmen of Abram and Lot begin to fight because they're cattle are so plentiful and there's not enough land, we know that Lot chooses that better land just on the other side of Jordan. And it's his selection, by the way, of where he wants to go live that ultimately gets him taken captive in what we read in the 14th chapter. So the relevance, it's all strung together. I don't think you can isolate and say, well, we'll just take this and we'll just take that. Equally so, when we read in the 14th chapter that Abram rescues Lot, and Lot is spared, there's some connections that need to be made. So you can't read, what I'm saying is you cannot read this isolated. You need the whole concept to take the whole matter together. Now, probably the biggest anomaly that is here is what I've just stated. If you read verse 16, that is 14:16, this is after all of the kings, they've taken Lot, and someone comes to tell Abram that Lot has been taken, and Abram takes the 318 men and pursues them unto Dan. And in verse 16 says, and he brought back all the goods, and also brought again his brother Lot and his goods, and the women also, and the people. And verse 17, it seems like it's disconnected. And the king of Sodom went out to meet him after his return from the slaughter at Kedar Laomer, and of the kings that were with him at the valley of Sheve, which is the king's dale, or the king's valley. And then we have, and Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine. It appears as though this is all squished together. Now remember, when we're reading scriptures, how lots of things happen between a chapter, between verses. We read it as continuous, but in between there may be gaps of time. So this sounds like the king of Sodom and Melchizedek were together, and we don't necessarily know that. That's number one. The other thing is this gap where we have Lot coming back, and then immediately goes into, and the king of Sodom went out to meet him after his return. The connection might be, what is the connection to the king of Sodom and Abram? There's all these different questions that might come into play. You might say, well, I thought you were going to give some answers tonight. Well, I am, but it also produces more questions. You can't help it. Well, we're going to fully examine the Masoretic text. We're going to examine the Septuagint. We're going to see discrepancies between the two in the text. We'll look at those, but the first thing I want us to jump right on is Melchizedek's name, because that's probably the most important thing we're going to have to deal with. It's almost like, okay, get over it. And the reason why I'm saying that is because when we read that name, there's something very fascinating about that name. But in Hebrew, the construction of words, in the Hebrew it's called, the word for building is binyan. Building blocks occur in Hebrew. So we take words in Hebrew and we build on them. So if the director will take my tablet, I will show you what Melchizedek in Genesis 14 looks like. We have here Melchizedek, Melech, Salem. Now, don't immediately say, I know what this means. We've got so many different problems to deal with. As you can see, the difference between Genesis 14 and Psalm 110 is the scholars decided to put a makef, this line, between Malki and Tzedek, which then changes the dimension or the meaning. The makef makes it one word, but there are other factors which we'll talk about grammatically, which could slightly alter the difference between no makef and makef. Although those are minute, we're examining the name for a purpose, for a reason. Now, I told you other questions will come out of this. So people are very fascinated when they hear Melchizedek, but what about something else? If we take this root to mean Melech, to mean king or ruler, But what about something I wrote down here in Hebrew that occurs in Joshua 10:1 and 3? Here is Adonai Tzedek. I'm trying to get some of you out of the mysticism of looking at the name Melech or Melchizedek versus Adonai Tzedek Melech, which is, let me pause here for a second. If we're going to put in the balance the weightier of the two names, which, as you can see, have some common construction, Adonai, which is used for Lord, would be an outweighing name over Melchi. Now, if these words are not familiar to you, in our Hebrew text, very often under the letters for Yahweh, we'll have the vowels for Adonai. The scholars did that so that we shouldn't pronounce the name of God, which is another anomaly. But my point is to get you to see that if there was weight behind the name, and names mean something in the Hebrew Bible, but if there was weight behind the name, the weightier name would come to Adonai, not to this Malki, in terms of weight. One being a king and one being a lord, and they're not necessarily synonyms. Now, I told you I was going to introduce things that they require us really thinking and asking questions. So here's the first question. Some of you are really fascinated by this person Melchizedek who appears out of nowhere, and just as quickly he disappears. I'm equally fascinated to read in Joshua 10, "Now it came to pass when Adonai Tzedek, king of Jerusalem." Now, I'm reading something to you to kind of shake you out of the, oh yeah, it's Melchizedek. I'm reading something that is quite anomalous here. Remember, when we study the history of the United Kingdom, we know that the first king begins with Saul, and after that we have David and we have Solomon. But the reference to a king of Jerusalem and the name Adonai Tzedek, which is the name I have just highlighted here on my tablet, is quite an anomaly. We read these things and we read right by them. And as I was preparing this, I recognized that here is another name of a person who appears out of nowhere. Sorry, folks, go look for it. He appears out of nowhere, but equally fascinating is King of Jerusalem, which as of to this point, and I'm trying to navigate so many pieces of the puzzle, so it may seem like I'm throwing information at you, but eventually it'll all kind of sift down to what's really important. We have names that are in their structure very much alike. And then we'll come back to deal with King of Jerusalem. Let's handle the names first things first. Because it's like you can go on so many different trails and you want to peel them all back. It's like an onion. You want to peel it all back at once, but you've got to go through the steps. So let's go back to my tablet. We have the starting point of Genesis 14 for Melchizedek. We have the reoccurrence in Psalm 110 with the Maketh that unites these two words together, making them essentially one. In Joshua 10:1 and 3, I don't know, for those people who are not studying Hebrew, you may not, I'm sure you'll be able to see the similarities here. Same Tzedek, same, and Melech, same word as here. So the other thing, another observation, is this ending, which appears with Malki and Adonai. So I'm trying to show a pattern of something, which once we see it, we'll say, okay, I see it in other places. Other names that are similar in the same construction as Melchizedek. I've put them on my tablet here. We have Malachiah, or the Yahu, Malachiahu. These are the scriptures, Jeremiah 22, or 21, 22, and 38. My king is Yah, short for Yahweh. This is somewhat interesting. Again, if we keep in mind that names mean something, and all of these have the same root or the same binyan. Now, this name will also be used for the father of Pashur. We've got it in 1 Chronicles 9:12 as the use of a priest. I'll go to my next page, hopefully. Number 3, of a Levite, the same name, and others in Ezra and in Nehemiah. Now, I'm still going down these Malki words. We have Malki Shua, which at first glance looks a little bit like, if they were read together, like Yeshua, but it's actually Malki, as in Ashua, rather, as in my cry, or to hear my cry, or to hear my help. It's a cognate of. We have another one of these, Malki El, my king is El. And that's the name of a person who is the son of Beriah of Asher, and also appearing in Genesis 46:17, Numbers 26:45, and 1 Chronicles 7:31. And then we have another, I'm trying to show you between the Melech and the Adonai. These are common constructions within the language. So you can see we have another one of these, Adonai and Yahu. My Lord is Yah, fourth son of David, a Levite, chief of the people. So the reason for doing this initially is to get us out of the mystic approach to the name. Now, although we're going to see what's probably really important about following the pattern of the name, when it's properly put in perspective, will kind of lose its zealous edge. And I don't want to make Melchizedek a lesser person. I just don't want it to be that it's so out there because we have two words and we've got that Tzedek word. Well, you just saw Adonai Tzedek in the same construction. And he's a person that obviously appears. And for all intents purposes, I will shoehorn this in now because we're going to end up having to talk about Salem. And what scholars have gone over ad nauseum is Salem, short for Yerushalem, for Jerusalem, which some hold to that, but there's a lot of issues here that just don't be quick to draw conclusions, because when we go to race to something, we find out that maybe because this is so far removed and because of the information we're dealing with, we may not have all the answers. We can only look at the things we know. The things we do know, for example, if you're going to talk about Jerusalem, was Melchizedek, king of Jerusalem. The first time we have Jerusalem introduced properly is not within the Pentateuch. That's the first thing we have to be mindful of. The second point of observation regarding Jerusalem is that if we follow the scriptures backwards, Jerusalem is called Jebus before it's called Jerusalem. We saw that in Joshua, and further on as we examine, this is the stronghold that David took of the Jebusites, which then later becomes Jerusalem. Now don't go running off and saying, but okay, then later, because it becomes Jerusalem at a later time. That's why this mention of Adonai Tzedek, king of Jerusalem, in Joshua 10 I said, is quite anomalous because Jerusalem has not yet been settled technically in our Bible. We're talking about biblically. We'll investigate archaeological concepts in detail later. The thing I'm concerned about is, at first blush, a person would quickly rush to the conclusion that Salem is Jerusalem. But indeed, if Jerusalem is Jebus, then the appearance of Jebus would appear as something akin to that. There's no J in Hebrew, so it would be Yod, Bet, something, either Samic or Sin or something, which is a far cry from the Shin Lamed Mem of Salem. Now, there's other issues on the table regarding the location, and these are fraught. They are all fraught with problems. This is part of picking, okay? This is part of what you have to do when you're going to, before you can go to secondary information, you've got to pick apart what you have as primary source, which is what we're doing. So, if we look at the name or the place, Salem, as a location, several problems come to mind, and I will share what they are. The first one, if you'll turn to Genesis 33, I'm giving you these examples because you've got to think a little bit outside the box. In Genesis 33 and verse 18, and Jacob came to Salem, a city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan. So these would be the same letters as the letters we're looking at for King of Salem. How do we distinguish between that which is Shechem, Salem, and Shechem? And there are many other references that we have to consider. You see, this is what, I'm just going to say it, this is what you're going to see. This is what I'm about. Research, comb the scriptures. You search for things, and I am against people being ignorant and drawing conclusions based on one thing that they heard. So, this is a problem. Now, there are great scholars like Gerhard von Rad, who wrote a commentary on Genesis, I think in the 60s. And his conclusion on Salem regarding this passage in Genesis 14 that we're dealing with in the person of Melchizedek is that he equated it with Jerusalem. And this is a big scholar. He equated it with Jerusalem, but then he turned around and said that obviously Salem had to be a fake name. Like, in other words, he said he equates it with Jerusalem, but then he turns around and he says, but this is a fake name. This could not possibly be the real name then. There are many scholars who will associate this with a place that is not too far from Nablus. There's myriad number of places that sound alike, and then we come up with, well, which place is this being referred to? Now, geographically speaking, and this is what's interesting, if you consider where this episode takes place, it's not that we can pinpoint definitively where this episode in Genesis 14 takes place so much as we know that Abram was living in Hebron at the time of this event. So there are a few things that we can deduce from locale, from the various kings, the 4 and 5 kings that made war with each other, and their possible locations, to come to some conclusions. So that's why I said be very careful about what you rush to immediately. Some have postulated that perhaps Melchizedek, being not necessarily a full and right name, in other words, some have associated Tzedek with a deity. Others have associated Melchizedek with a Canaanite deity. Others have associated not Salem, but Salim with a Canaanite deity. There's a rainbow of stuff out there. And don't think I'm just throwing it out tonight and we're not going to come back to it. These are a part of the sources that we will have to draw upon to eventually draw some solid conclusions. Now, what we do know is we have a list of kings that made war. As I said, the 4 and the 5 that made war with each other. And I took the time to write these out to demonstrate something to you on my tablet, to show something. So let's erase this. And at the very top of this in the black, you have rewritten Melchizedek, Melech, Salem. And then in descending order as they appear in Genesis 14, from Genesis 14:1 onward, you've got, for example, Amraphel, Melech, Shinar. So I have put them out to show. See if we can go to the next page. These are all the kings listed. The only anomaly in this picture is the last king that is listed is not listed in the same fashion as the others. As you can see all the way through, Melech appears in the middle in the last case, and King Bela, and so forth. So that's the only thing that is anomalous. It occurs out of order. However, what I would like you to see, going back to this first page, is how they're all kings of something. Now, the relevance of putting this again in this order and showing it like this is it slightly demystifies this person we're referring to when you see all of the names lined up. And then you begin to pick apart some of what maybe some are hypothesized, the meanings and representations of their names. Some are in type, real places that are identifiable. For example, the last name, which is number 4, that appears in your King James as title, King of Nations, Tidal, Melech, Goyim, which we've studied this word for people, nations, and sometimes used of Gentiles. But all of these names, if we were just simply going from a Hebrew perspective, have meaning. So for example, title is, he's actually the king of fear. And there's just some very strange names. For example, here we have Amraphel, which is the people's judge. If we were going from a Hebrew perspective, the people's judge. So it's not that far off when you're looking at how these names might be understood or translated, to come back and look at Melchizedek's name in the same light. Names have meanings. That's one way of looking at the text as it occurs. Now there's logic behind all this, which is when we read our King James, we cannot see these certain things. Let me go down the list of these. These are some nasty guys over here. Bera, if we're just taking a Hebrew perspective, I'll go from a Canaanite and other information afterwards. But just from a Hebrew perspective, we'd have here son of evil. Nice group of people here. We have Birsha, which is son of wickedness. So we're just kind of assessing here. Some of these are kind of hard for me even to read. This one is a little bit strange. from a Hebrew perspective, we have this word which it means a father's tooth. I don't know. Don't ask me. I don't know. And what else do we have here? We have Shemeber, which it looks like it's a combination of two things, but it's not. Soaring heights. But we need to step out of the way we would normally see things, or the way we would normally approach things. And here, Bela, by the way, is king of destruction. That's from a Hebrew perspective. And you've got all of you've got Sodom, you've got all the places going down, which we could discuss and pick apart. But the reason for doing this is to show you the names from a Hebrew perspective carry weight. Now, if these are, we'll call them other nations, which they are, and I believe existed, at least some of these, indeed, we have records of them existing. I go to my notes here. You'll find, for example, Amraphel, who is on our first list. Wrong direction. There we go. This king right here is identified with the Akkadian Shankar. So there are certain people that are in here that are not, they're actual real people. We've identifiably, there are references, whether it is in clay, cuneiform, or other references, which we will have to, by the way, deal with down the road. There's some references that could be helpful from the El Aramana tablets and other things that may lead us down some creative thinking, because there's a lot of facts, and then there's going to be a lot of conjecture based on what's presented. Now, I'm not going to do too much conjecturing myself, but I'm saying that's where the mind goes. You begin to form ideas, and here we go. And so we're talking about real people, though. That brings me back into the text. So we have this event that has happened. And within this event, there's some equally interesting things that should be mentioned. Again, analyzing the text of Genesis 14 helps us to understand what happens with the appearing of this person who, if people believe that, and there are various hypotheses, for example, that Melchizedek is Shem, or he's a theophany, or he's a Christophany, or he is, and we keep, he's an angelic being, but all of those put in proper perspective will actually be suppressed by analyzing the text and seeing a few things for ourselves that become self-evident. Take a look at, in Genesis 14, we have 4 kings making war with 5 kings. Came to pass in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Ariah, king of Elisar, which is an actual place identified with Ilsar or Ilsanar, Kedor Laomer, king of Elam, title king of the nations, that these made war with Bera, king of Sodom, and with Birsha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, and Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, which is Zoar. All these were joined together in the vale of Siddim, which is the Salt Sea. Now, before I pass up this opportunity, let me find my Hebrew text somewhere, which is right in front of me. It's good when you put things right in front of you to not lose sight of them, and then you can't find them. All right. So a little bit slightly different reading from the Masoretic text when reading word for word when you get down to where it says these were joined together in the vale of Siddim, which is the Salt Sea. That's the third verse. I want the second one. That these made war is what I'm looking at. They made war with. It sounds as though it was in the reading of the King James, as though it was a conglomerate of 9 kings. But in fact, it's 4 against 5. And it says 12 years they served Chedorlaomer, and in the 13th year they rebelled. The vassalage was finished. The 14th year came, Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him, and smote the Rephaims in Ashtaroth Karnaim, and the Zuzims in Ham, and the Imims in Shavik Kirathim. Now what's interesting is that these 3 mentions, the Rephaims, the Zuzims, and the Imims, are referencing 3 diverse communities of giants. And a lot of people ask where the giants went. The giants are being referred to elsewhere in another passage in Genesis. Here we have 3 different communities of giants. And if you read the book of Jubilees, these are giants maybe of 10 to 15 feet in height. Nevertheless, 3 communities, 3 consecutive communities of giants are taken out. And the Horites in their Mount Seir. So they went after these 3 consecutive communities of giants and the Horites. And they returned and came to Mishpat, which is Kadesh, and smote all the country of the Amalekites and also the Amorites that dwelt in Hazazon Tamar. Now, this is the part where you've got to read carefully. There went out the king of Sodom and the king of Gomorrah, and the king of Admah, and the king of Zeboim, the king of Bela, the same as Zoar, and they joined battle with them in the vale of Siddim, which is the salt pits, which is now the Salt Sea, the salt pits, or the salty pits. With Chedorlaomer, the king of Elam, with the title kings of nations, and so 4 with the 5. And the vale of Siddim was full of slime pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled and fell there. Now, read this very carefully. The kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, respectively, they fell there, and they that remained fled to the mountain, because it is reading, jumping ahead, it's the king of Sodom that will go out to meet Abram. So this is where reading the text can be a little bit taxing. And if you're strictly sticking to King James, it can be even more taxing than reading in the Hebrew. They took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their victuals and went their way. And they took Lot, Abraham's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. And there came one that had escaped and told Abram the Hebrew, which we know this Abiru and Apiru will be a huge subject if we were going to pursue that line of interest through Genesis and Exodus, but right now that's not the subject here, so park that thought. For he dwelt in the plain of Mamre, the Amorite brother of Eshcol and the brother of Aner, and these that were confederate with Abram. And when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his trained servants born in his own house. There were 318, and pursued them unto Dan. I thought he would have said, let him keep them. Divided himself against them, he and his servants, by night smote them, pursued them unto Hobah, which is on the left hand of Damascus. And he brought back all the goods, and also brought again his brother Lot and his goods, and the women also, and the people. Let me stop there. So that's why I said this is only an introduction, because there are so many things that have been said here geographically to perhaps help us with what's coming up, which we're not going to deal with tonight. But there's geography involved in this. And there are some things in here that I feel the King James did not adequately translate, which could help us going from the Masoretic text, which we will look at. And then you get to this, we've got this terrible picture. We've got Abram who gets in there, and he and his 318 divided men unleash a can of, you know what, get back Lot, the goods, the women, and all the people. And the king of Sodom went out to meet him after his return from the slaughter of Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him at the valley of Shaveh, which is the king's dale, or the valley of the kings, which is another problematic issue, because if it is the valley of the kings, as we commonly know it, which it has been alluded to by some, that puts it in another geographical area far outside the region we were even considering. Problem after problem after problem. All right. And just here, and Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. You notice that was is italicized. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thine hand. And he gave him tithes of all. Now, at a later time, we will also discuss someone who wrote in the mid-300s. So there's one who wrote in the late 190s and one who wrote in the mid-300s, using this text to support and defend tithing in the church. But if this is rightly understood, and this whole passage is rightly understood, we'll see why somebody would have taken the time to write a diversity of treatises on this subject out of this passage. But let's finish the section here. Verse 21, And the king of Sodom said unto Abram, Give me the persons, and take the goods to thyself. And Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted up my hand unto the Lord, the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take from a thread, even to a shoe latchet, that I will not take anything that is thine, lest thou shouldest say, I have made Abram rich, save only that which the young men have eaten, and the portion of the men which went with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre, let them take their portion. Now, we've just finished reading the King James, and here comes the fun part. The Septuagint of this has some discrepancies. I put the obvious ones out on my tablet for us to look at. The Masoretic text reads bread and wine. The Septuagint reads artus, which is bread plural, which could be construed as loaves. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. That's kind of one that you could just say, okay, it's not a big deal. But the next one is. The Masoretic text has the king of Sodom saying, keep the possessions, the spoils. The Septuagint reads, take the horses to yourself. And this is one where if you don't believe my observations, you can pick up a Septuagint for yourself. In fact, it's not quite sure if it's horse or horses. I put it in the plural based on how I translated it. That's a little bit disturbing. And there'll be a point to highlighting these discrepancies and how relevant they will become for our study of the other reference of Melchizedek in Psalm 110. But let's look at the next one. In 1421, in the Masoretic text, Genesis 14:21, the construction of the definite article on the nephesh, which is being translated in our King James as the souls, I believe, persons, and in the margin reads souls. What is interesting is that in the Masoretic text we have a feminine singular noun, so it's being used as a collective or corporate. The translators of the Septuagint chose to use a plural use of andros. And these are significant. Likewise, the significance in the Masoretic text of the name, which we are reading in the King James as Most High God, which in the Masoretic text is El Elyon, but in the Septuagint, they did not carry the name through. So we have Theon, tu uphistu, which does not equal the Hebrew, the Masoretic text. And lastly, I think there's one more. There we go. Masoretic text in 1424, the verb, the Hebrew verb lakeh, is in the jussive form, which is in your King James reading, let them take their portion. In the Septuagint, it is a future tense, they shall take a portion. Now, why highlight these discrepancies? Because not so much for our text in Genesis, but when we go to translate and investigate Psalm 110, this is going to be a huge problem. Why? Because the Pentateuch, and specifically the book of Genesis, I'm sure as they started endeavoring, the Septuagint translators started the endeavor to translate from Hebrew into Greek. At this point, there are no issues with prophecy and prophetic pointings to Christ. Remember, the Septuagint is being done 200-300 years before Christ. So we're just seeing some discrepancies that will not alter our text per se. But what they will do is they'll demonstrate that 200 to 300 years before Christ, if a person translating did not see the clear picture pointing to Christ, the errors in translation, as we just seen discrepancies in our own text, could be magnified. Remember, they weren't looking, these are Jewish scholars looking to translate into the Greek language. They're not looking for, they're looking for Messiah, but not the way we understand or see him. And the things that David wrote of in the day that he wrote them were foretelling, just like Psalm 2, foretelling of Christ. So if we see the discrepancies here, they may be enlarged when we get to Psalm 110. And these are incredibly important clues if we are looking to understand the verity of translation in these particular scarce verses we're examining. So, I've got more to say, but right now we're going to take a little break. If you're saying, well, I thought you were going to do this and that, well, we can't do it all tonight. I just said this is only an introduction, and we're only talking about primary material. And as I said, the material that is available far surpasses what one might imagine. And I just happen to be fortunate enough to have, I would say, 99% of the material in my possession. So that makes it real easy for us to be able to show and tell right here. But right now, as I said, I'm not done. I need you to get on the telephone, get busy. You know, typical me. I like to jump ship and not read everything that I put down, which is why I said I'm considering just, I've got pages upon pages of notes that are in somewhat decent form. It wouldn't take much for somebody to just put them into good reading shape with lots of different notations. One of the things that I did miss in here, I'm just kind of thumbing through. Some of you who read the New Testament may say, well, what about the Salem, which is mentioned in John 3:23? And if you trace that, that is a town not far from Pella. So it's different region, different area. And then on another note, if you're still going to travel with me down the diversity, because we must examine all this information. If we're going to go down the pathway of talking about Shem, as some have hypothesized and some have stated, It's noteworthy that if you read the book of Jubilees, you will find in the book of Jubilees that it says Shem built a city called Sedukatelbab, which is the name of his wife. Yeah, couldn't he just get a wife named Sally? So I definitely think there's things in here, as I said, I produce copious amounts of things. Most of it's in my brain, but I think at some point I'm going to pray about making these available to you in some form because there's just so much stuff in here, including, I've just briefly touched on these, but going back to the places, the name and mention of places, in the Canaanite realm and in a diversity of that stream, you'll find Uru founded by Salem is not being equated to Jerusalem. It's being equated to a Canaanite Amorite god. So that's just food for thought. By the way, I also have other interesting notes in here. The archaeologist, the famous archaeologist W.F. Albright, claims that the two oldest rulers of this city, which is Jerusalem, the one I just mentioned, the two oldest rulers are Saz Anu and Yakir Amo, that are Amoritic. See, it depends on, I guess, where you're coming from. I'm not done. As I said, this is just an introduction, so it's like you've got to put out enough information to get a broad picture of the things we must pick apart. But there is something integrally important in the text that I do want you to see. When we talk about Melchizedek as king, we will also have to discuss the functions of a king, what would be expected. I want to use a terminology that may not be absolutely correct, but we're going to call it prehistoric times in terms of the chronicles that we do have as historic according to Bible and archaeology, versus those periods which tend to be, there's less information, there's less data. When we talk about kingship, there are certain functions that a king would do. We just saw these kings going out to battle. It was expected for a king to go out to battle. So we have an anomaly with Melchizedek coming out to offer bread and wine and not being a warrior, not going out to war and to make war, to be with Abram. These are the questions one must ask. Why didn't he appear before and go out to war with him? Because that's what a typical king would do. And then, so that's another pocket of questions we'll have to talk about. That's the way you have to treat a subject. You're like, wow, I'm so frustrated. Why did she do this? There's also the priest perspective, and this is probably the one that is the most relevant to us in this discussion tonight, both within the text and within the broader picture. For the rabbis, for the rabbins in the rabbinic tradition, what was so important was the fact that Melchizedek is the first priest mentioned in the Bible. He's the first one. So many traditions were spawned out of the fact that this is the first of its kind, first in the Pentateuch, first of its kind. That being said, there needs to be some definition of what priestly work of any type in that period may have looked like. Now, there are many people, many scholars, and I don't want to tell you how many books that I opened and I tossed them away, because I recognize, see, this is what happens. When you really are doing research, you're going to know who's plagiarizing who's just merely parroting back what the other guy said because he sounds smart. You eventually get so familiar with all the material. And that's what research is about, especially in biblical, archaeological, anything that you do. This is a gratuitous footnote. Why do you think, this is why I get angry at those people on the internet who would like to plagiarize Dr. Scott, and I'm completely against that to begin with. But I'm even more against it because they do it under the guise of teaching other people. And if you're genuinely interested in teaching other people, you're going to do exactly what Paul said to Timothy: study to show thyself approved. You get in there and you open those books, and if you form a different conclusion, be ready to give the reason for it. Back it up with the substance. Show your references. If there are references, show them. That's the most decent thing to do. I got this from this place and from this book, which, by the way, if you were reading my notes, there's a plethora of references to archaeologists, to dictionaries, to things that I've used. That's why I said I'd like to make these available so you can, if you want to get the references yourself, or you can say, okay, I believe you. But my point is, if you want to know what makes me angry, is when people just take things and they don't even bother to go and verify. And I'm praying that you're beginning to see this is the nature, not only of how I'm handling, this is how I handle everything pertaining to my calling and the Word of God. I will not take anybody's word. I'm going to have checked every single resource I have available. And then, if the jury's not in conclusively, I'm also going to tell you that. I'm weaving in some things tonight that when I bring resources, I want to be able to give you the history and the background of these resources, tell you why they're vitally important to our study, and then tell you whether or not I agree with them. There's plenty of people I disagree with, and I'm not afraid to say it. That's my right after I've looked at all of the information. So I hope you're getting a feel for why I get angry at those people out there that they fancy themselves as scholars, and they're nothing but cheap wannabe dumb people because they haven't taken the time to open up a book to realize, oh, there are other factors that I should look at. And I should say parenthetically, lest anybody take what I'm saying out of context. From the time that Dr. Scott presented much of his teachings, we called them band teachings back in the day, a lot of the books that he was using, which I still call gold standard, Velikovsky and other books that are just gold standard if you're going to read and research. But I'd also say those are gold standard, but since approximately the mid to late 80s, there has been a flood of new material that is not necessarily new material, but it's being reassessed in the light of other documents that have surfaced. Will they change the outcome of our information? Maybe not. But you form a conclusion based on the resources you have available. And I'm saying that Dr. Scott formed his conclusions based on what was available in his time. We're now talking 30 plus years has elapsed, 25, 30 years, and a whole batch of new information. And when I say that, I'm talking about information that relates to different findings that have just come to light. Findings that were made in the 60s and 70s that basically went into the universities and went with the scholars and disappeared for the sum of 15 and 20 years and have recently been released. We'll discuss those as well, and we'll consider them as well. Then we can form a conclusion. I'm not going to stop saying that until you get the idea that if you were in university and you were studying to obtain a Ph.D. and you would have to write a dissertation, you'd have to be familiar with all of these people's work. And when it came time to write your Ph.D. or dissertation, it would have to be an original contribution. Well, this is kind of what we're doing. We're taking the information, and it doesn't necessarily have to be original, but it has to be the sifting of all these things till we take away with us the most important parts. And for me, this is the most important part. I can tell you many of the pieces of information I've patched together are from resources. This part is not. This is from my own workings through the scriptures. I come back to the text. So, what we have in terms of his priestly work, Melchizedek's priestly work, within the confines of Genesis 14, 18 through 20, we have him bringing out bread and wine. We have Melchizedek, he blessed Abram there's a key word here, by God, El Elyon, maker of heaven and earth, and Melchizedek blessed God, El Elyon, who delivered your enemies into your hand. So I would like you to see my observation of this, because it's not quite apparent when we read the text at first blush. It's only 18, 19, and 20, 3 verses. But in between these 3 verses is something quite important. Here we have the verb in the Hebrew to bless. You can see here, baruch, baruch. And it is in the call, passive participle. Remember, Melchizedek is saying this, and he is blessing Abram. Blessing, the blessing is understand what the passive, I should explain that for those people who are not studying Hebrew. So active and passive. Active, in the active participle, the action is being done. Same thing like Greek, the action is being performed, there's an activity. Passive is the recipient, standing still essentially and receiving. That's the easiest way to explain it. Perhaps not the most correct, but the easiest. So we have a passive participle, Abram being the recipient, being blessed. We've got this lamed preposition, le'el, by. Normally this would be to, but to or by, if you read your Brown Driver Brig, by El Elyon, maker of heaven and earth. And then we have the blessing going the other way. And Melchizedek, he blessed God. Also in the call passive participle. Now, if you split these verses as I've done, putting Melchizedek blessing Abram up top, and Melchizedek is blessing God at the bottom. And in between we have the reference of maker of heaven and earth, and delivered your enemies, and he gave him a tithe. And right in the middle, for the first time ever, we see a mediator. Here he's addressing man. Here he's addressing God. That's the first time. And I would tell you, if I saw this or read this somewhere, I like to give my sources. This is my observation of looking at this scripture. It's the first, you really cannot see it adequately in the English, but I clearly seeing that both of these verbs are in the call passive participle. And one is going manward and one is going Godward. We have the first picture of mediator. Remember, the whole goal is analyzing this to help us better ascertain the purpose and reason for introducing this figure in the book of Hebrews. So we have this first concept right here, which has another factor to it, equal to God, who is, it says here, possessor of heaven and earth. I translated from the Hebrew, but your King James says possessor of heaven and earth. And the strange thing that he gave him tithes of all, which I believe are equally, there is a connection to these two concepts, which we will revisit, having to do with picking apart this scripture. So we've got equal parts of the blessing, and we've got equal parts, possessor of heaven and earth, delivered you from your enemies, he gave him a tithe, and right in the middle we have the mediator. Now, you need to kind of put that in your brain. That is invisibly but surely there. Now, part of the problem in this discussion, if Melchizedek is a theophany or a Christophany, it's untenable to think that he is a Christophany or a theophany. That's a better way of saying it. And the reason being is this. Previously, We have God speaking to Abram directly to get out of his country. And then before this event happens, we have God speaking he speaks to him clearly. And then, at the end of this, we have in chapter 15, that's why I said read through 15:1, we have the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Came to him in a vision. So it's almost an untenable conjecture to say that Melchizedek is a theophany or a Christophany based on the fact that Abram is one of the few people that God spoke to audibly, came to him in a vision, appeared to him. We do have the appearance of the three appearing to him on the plains of Mamre by the tent door. So with so much going on, do we really need to have someone who is kind of in the improper position? And the answer is no. It's not logical. It's not even a probable hypothesis. Considering, that's why I said, if you read 13 through 15, you will draw certain conclusions that if you weren't looking for these before, you might not come to these. Equally so, the fact that he appears and he disappears. This is another fancy subject we have here. If that only happened to Melchizedek, I'd say we have something to really consider. But we have people appearing in the Bible, appearing and disappearing, appearing out of nowhere. I just mentioned one of those in Joshua. Who is Adonai-Tzedek? Who is that guy? Where did he come from? Right? But there are other people where we have the same issues. They crop out of nowhere. It's as if God was not concerned to tell us a deep background. I'll give you a perfect case in point. We have Moses' father-in-law in Exodus 2 and in Exodus 3, Jethro. Appears as a priest of Midian. He's got the 7 daughters. We don't even know about his wife. We just know he's got 7 daughters. He did something somehow because he has 7 daughters. But he's a priest. This is the important thing. The King James may use a definite article and say priest of, I don't think it does, priest of Midian. The Hebrew is very clear that there is no definite article, which means he was a priest, and we could conclude a priest in Midian. Midian was a place. And he could have been a priest among many priests. We don't have any information. And the only thing we can know about Midian is that Midian was produced by the second wife of Abraham, Keturah. That was a product of he was a busy man. Think about it. After Sarah dies, you think he'd say, okay, I'm done trying to make kids and let me just settle down. But he married again. He had more kids. It's like, wow, we're on a roll. Don't stop. And hey, God said I was going to be father of many, and by golly, before I die, I'm going to make that happen, right? But Midian is a product of Abraham and Keturah. And that is the child's name, which undoubtedly becomes a territory, so we have a connection. And the question might be, we could only speculate because we have no other reference. Jethro appears out of nowhere. He has no lineage. God is not concerned to tell us about Jethro's lineage. But we might ask the question, priest of Midian, what kind of priest? Was this a desert kind of Bedouin priest? Was this a Canaanite type priest? Or could this possibly, is it even remotely possible that this, being a child of Abraham, was at least taught about the living God and about some of God's ways and perpetuated some of the ways of God? And it's possible down through the generations that this happened. We don't know. We're not told. The only thing we know is 7 daughters. That's all. And later on, he offers counsel. Now, perhaps the priest of Midian was considered as simply a chief in his community and not a priest as we know, as we are familiar with, like the Levitical and Aaronic lines. But he appears, and the mention of him being a priest appears, and it's as if when God has no use to give a background, he doesn't, and if there's no use to further the conversation, Jethro eventually will also disappear. It's obvious he died, but he disappears out of the scripture eventually. other priests within the Pentateuch, because I just ventured into the book of Exodus. Within Genesis, we have the mention of Potiphar, which is not anywhere close to a priest like we're talking about, but still the mention of a priest, the priest of On, which is very safe to conclude is a city and not the god. Probably the god was Re or something. And we don't know what type of functions this particular priest had, but I study a lot of the histories of Egypt in all of the dynastic periods. So I do know firsthand some of the changes that occurred in the meaning of priest as the dynasties developed, with certain different things happening between dynastic rules. That being said, we do know that using the term priest connotes certain things, whether it is a cultic practice, whether that entails sacrifices and offerings. So let me bring you back into the scripture to ask a question. Did we need Melchizedek introduced to perform something that Abram was already performing? Remember, in an earlier chapter, he builds an altar. That's in chapter 12. Needless to say that if he built an altar, he undoubtedly offered an offering on that altar, which eventually would become part of, as you move towards Moses and the Levitical and the prescribed law would become part of the priest's functions. But we have Abram building an altar and undoubtedly doing the functions which at a later time a priest would do, offering sacrifice upon the altar. So the appearance of Melchizedek is not just randomly put there. As I said, we have the first picture of mediation between man and God. And in the picture type, it's very clear. We see liturgical practices. They may not be honed, but they're liturgical practices on the part of Abram already being carried out. So we didn't need to have Melchizedek introduced to carry on further of those. They were already being done. It started in the garden with God killing an animal, with the offerings of Cain and Abel all the way down. So the priesthood here is kind of an important, it's an important thing to examine here, because we're seeing something of a completely new function that has not yet been done at all. Up until now, we know when we read earlier in Genesis, it says, then men started to call on the name of the Lord, but there was no mediator per se. So we have, I'm going to use a very careful word, we have a prototype of something. And I'm just going to leave that there for future time, future conversation. Equally of interest in this topic we're discussing is the fact that when we talk about priesthood through the Old Testament, I think it's in 1 Chronicles 6, 5 or 6, you have the longest genealogical chronicling of a lineage or pedigree of priests. 25 generations of priests, starting at Levi, working all the way, 25 generations apparently. And from that, which is the extreme, because the Rabbinic and Judaic community valued the pedigree of a person. Remember, when they came back in Ezra and Nehemiah's day, if they could not prove their pedigree, their lineage to priesthood, they were not allowed to serve. So there's this huge imprint on genealogy and having a genealogical background, father that passed it on to son and so forth. So there's a lot of speculation within the Judaic community and other writings that say that Melchizedek passed on his priesthood to Abram. And the problem that I have with that is if that was the case, then Abram would have passed on his priesthood to Isaac, and Isaac would have passed it on to Jacob. We have the birthright blessings that were given to Abram beforehand. So this idea of descending, that it had to be perpetuated, was of necessity created by the rabbinic community, which had this gold standard. A pedigree must be available to certify that one is qualified to serve in this position. So here we have a person appearing out of nowhere who, when we get into the book of Hebrews, we'll have to examine why did the writer of Hebrews say, without mother, without father, without genealogy, which have caused many to speculate and go down pathways that were very erroneous. Now, I think I'm going to wrap this up here. I'm going to leave you with something that will at least give you an idea of the type of things that came out of a lack of studying and examination and a lack of materials. When we get to examining the text in Hebrews, you'll understand why the first 5 centuries of church history become important. Some of you who are familiar with church history have read many of those titles. You've read them and gone, oh, I don't want to read that, like, against the heresies of so-and-so and against the heresies. There are volumes of church fathers writing against the heresies of so-and-so. And we'll talk about this probably in some of these studies coming up. There was a group of people. They were referred to as the Melchizedekians. Their name being referred to, but that was not how they referred to themselves. And essentially, they propagated a plethora of errors based on a misinterpretation of Hebrews. And from that, writing started to pour out to combat the heresies that were beginning to spill over into the churches. So this is a good place to leave this, because what I've done tonight is at least laid some of the groundwork. We'll have to periodically come back and reference this section out of Genesis. We will investigate Psalm 110, and there's a lot there to investigate. It's not just limited to that one verse, because that one verse is important for us with the reference to Melchizedek, because it carries over into the book of Hebrews. But Psalm 110 held a lot of weight with Jesus into the New Testament. So when we begin to analyze that psalm, there are certain things that will become abundantly clear. And if we're not careful to examine the text in light of the Masoretic text, in light of the Septuagint, which may have some errors in translation, based on my observation, it's possible, we will at least walk away with how much of a picture we can put together from the Old Testament. And then we will go to secondary sources. And you might be surprised at the secondary sources that, when they're introduced, they will provide at least a glimpse into the mindset of where some of these other ideas were propagated and stem from. Now, hopefully, we'll have a lot of time to do this. As I said, I decided I was not going to rush, because that's my big thing, is I want to get it all, and I want to put it all out there, but it doesn't work that way, because there's a lot of things to assimilate and take into consideration. And I think I've asked a lot of questions and introduced questions to you tonight that perhaps previously were not even considered. And maybe they were, but they need to be reconsidered and re-examined. And as we go forward, we may find other areas that we'll have to question again. Like, for example, here's my last question to you. Who is Ira the Gyrate, who is the priest being listed as one of the priests that was in the company of David, who has no lineage? And the King James does a terrible thing by calling him an officer or some other word, but if you read it in the Hebrew, he's Kohen, he's priest. And there's another one of these. I think his name is Zabud. Appears in another list just like that. No lineage, no reference. And he's labeled in the King James as an officer. So I hope I've made you ask more questions tonight. And the thought really should be centered around an introduction of a concept. Really the most fundamental one, and perhaps the most crucial one, is seeing this first concept being introduced as a mediator, blessing both God and man, right there in Genesis 14. Get on the telephone.
Come to this house.